Good day, children. I hope you're fine. I'm Anupreet Kaur from the Chandigarh Education Department. Children, when you're in school and you take your tiffins there, suppose one of your friends has not got the tiffin and is feeling hungry. Will you share your food with the friend? I'm sure you will. I think you'll give at least half your food to your friend. And children, if there's a poor child who does not know you at all, who is a stranger to you, if that child is feeling hungry and comes to you, will you share your food with that child? I'm sure you will. You may not give that child half your food, but you will definitely give at least some food to the child because you are generous, you are kind, you care and you share. Today, children, we will study a poem about a woman who was not like you at all, who was not generous, who was not kind. Rather, she was miserly. Today, we will study the poem A Legend of the Northland by Phoebe Cary from the NCERT textbook Beehive for Class 9. Phoebe Cary was an American poetess and the younger sister of poetess Alice Cary. The sisters co-published poems in 1849 and then went on to publish volumes of their own. Phoebe was born on September 4, 1824 in Ohio, USA. Her famous works are Poems of Alice and Phoebe Cary, Poems and Parodies, Poems of Faith, Hope and Love, Ballads for Little Folk. Now let's enjoy the poem, A Legend of the Northland. Away, away in the Northland, where the hours of the day are few, and the nights are so long in winter that they cannot sleep them through, where they harness the swift reindeer to the sledges when it snows, and the children look like bears' cubs in their funny furry clothes. They tell them a curious story. I don't believe it's true. And yet you may learn a lesson if I tell the tale to you. Once, when the good Saint Peter lived in the world below and walked about it preaching, just as he did, he came to the door of a cottage in traveling round the earth, where a little woman was making cakes and baking them on the hearth. And being faint with fasting, for the day was almost done, he asked her from her store of cakes to give him a single one. So she made a very little cake. But as it baking lay, she looked at it and thought it seemed too large to give away. Therefore, she needed another and still a smaller one. But it looked, when she turned it over, as large as the first one had done. Then she took a tiny scrap of dough and rolled it flat and baked it thin as a wafer. But she couldn't part with that, for she said, my cakes that seem too small when I eat of them myself are yet too large to give away. So she put them on the shelf. Then good Saint Peter grew angry, for he was hungry and faint. And surely such a woman was enough to provoke a saint. And he said, you're far too selfish to dwell in a human form, to have both food and shelter and fire to keep you warm. Now you shall build as the birds do, and shall get your scanty food by boring and boring and boring all day in the hard, dry wood. Then up she went through the chimney, never speaking a word, and out of the top flew a woodpecker, for she was changed to a bird. She had a scarlet cap on her head, and that was left the same. But all the rest of her clothes were burned, black as a coal in the flame. And every country schoolboy has seen her in the wood, where she lives in the trees till this very day, boring and boring for food. Now children, I would like you to recite the poem with me. A legend of the Northland. Away, away in the Northland, where the hours of the day are few, and the nights are so long in winter that they cannot sleep them through, where they harness the swift reindeer to the sledges when it snows, and the children look like bear's cubs in their funny furry clothes. They tell them a curious story. I don't believe it is true. And yet you may learn a lesson if I tell the tale to you. Once when the good Saint Peter lived in the world below and walked about it preaching, just as he did, he came to the door of a cottage in traveling round the earth, where a little woman was making cakes and baking them on the hearth. And being faint with fasting, for the day was almost done, he asked her from her store of cakes to give him a single one. So she made a very little cake. But as it baking lay, she looked at it and thought it seemed too large to give away. Therefore, she needed another and still a smaller one. But it looked, when she turned it over, as large as the first had done. Then she took a tiny scrap of dough and rolled it flat and baked it thin as a wafer. But she couldn't part with that, for she said, "My cakes that seem too small when I eat of them myself are yet too large to give away." So she put them on the shelf. Then good Saint Peter grew angry, for he was hungry and faint, and surely such a woman was enough to provoke a saint. And he said, "You are far too selfish to dwell in a human form, to have both food and shelter and a fire to keep you warm. Now you shall build as birds do, and shall get your scanty food by boring and boring and boring all day in the hard dry wood." Then up she went through the chimney, never speaking a word, and out of the top flew a woodpecker, for she was changed to a bird. She had a scarlet cap on her head, and that was left the same, but all the rest of her clothes were burned black as a coal in the flame. And every country schoolboy has seen her in the wood, where she lives in the trees till this very day, boring and boring for food. This poem, A Legend of the Northland, is actually a ballad. A ballad is a song narrating a story in short stanzas. Ballads are a part of folk culture or popular culture and are passed on orally from one generation to the next. A legend of the Northland. Children, a legend means an old traditional story. It generally has a message or a moral. And Northland? Where is Northland? Well, Northland could be any place close to the North Pole. So it could be any country in the Earth's North Polar region. It could be the peninsula containing Norway and Sweden. We could also have parts of Russia or even Canada in it. So this poem narrates the legend of a lady who angered Saint Peter because of her greed. So children, away, away in the Northland, where the hours of the day are few and the nights are so long in winter that they cannot sleep them through. Children, why do you think the nights are so long and the days are short near the Arctic region or in the Northland? Because, as you have studied in geography, the Earth is geoid in shape. The sun's rays fall directly on the equator, but they are slanting towards the poles. And when the sun is directly overhead on the Tropic of Cancer, it is summer in the northern hemisphere. At that time, the days are long and the nights are short. But when the sun is directly overhead on the Tropic of Capricorn, it is summer in the southern hemisphere, but it is winter in the Northern Hemisphere. And during winter, the days are very short and the nights are very long. And children, the nights are so long that you cannot sleep all through the night. Although there's some people who love sleeping, they can sleep for long hours. But by and large, one wants to be up. Where they harness the swift reindeer to the sledges when it snows. So they're talking about Northland, a place which has extreme winter and where they have reindeers and sledges, where there is snow. So what do they do with the sledges? People take rides in them, people travel in them. What is harnessing? Children, harness is a set of straps and fittings by which a horse or a reindeer or a dog or some other draught animal is fastened to the cart or a plough or a sledge, etc. It is controlled by a driver. To harness means to control and to make use of. So here people make use of those animals and they try to control them with the help of those straps and fittings. So the poetess talks about reindeers being harnessed to sledges. The children in Northland look like bears' cubs in their funny furry clothes. How can they look like bears' cubs? Because they're wearing furry clothes. So that's such a cute image. They look funny, they look ridiculous, but of course they have to wear furry clothes to keep warm. Otherwise, they will fall sick because it's very cold winter. They tell them a strange story, a very curious story. So who are they? They are the parents or perhaps grandparents or elders who tell these children this story. I don't believe it's true. So the poetess says, yes, the story is told to the children, but the poetess herself does not believe that it's a true story. But she says, at the same time, yet you may learn a lesson if I tell the tale to you. She says, I want to tell you this tale so that you can also learn a lesson from this story. Once, when the good Saint Peter lived in the world below and walked about it preaching just as he did, you know. So who is Saint Peter? Saint Peter was an apostle of Jesus Christ. He was one of the early 12 disciples. And an apostle means a teacher, a missionary. And where did he live? He lived in the world below means he lived on earth. Well, where is Saint Peter now? He's in heaven. So she says when Saint Peter was on the earth, he walked about it. He was preaching his sermons. He was giving moral advice to people. That's what he did during his lifetime. While he was preaching, going from place to place, he came to the door of a cottage in traveling round the earth, where a little woman was making cakes and baking them on the hearth. So he comes to this cottage where there was a little woman who was making cakes. And where was she baking those cakes? In the hearth, which is a wooden oven, which is in a fireplace. And being faint with fasting. So Saint Peter was very hungry. He was feeling very faint, very weak, because he had not eaten in a long time. For the day was almost done. Now it was almost evening. He asked her from her store of cakes to give him a single one. So what did Saint Peter ask the woman for? He asked her to give him one piece of cake. And she had a lot of them because she had been baking for a long time perhaps. He only asked for one cake. So she made a little cake, but as it baking lay, she looked at it and thought it seemed too large to give away. Now this woman is a miser. She did not give him any of the cakes that she had ready. She wanted to give him a smaller cake. So she made a very little cake, a very small cake. And while it was still baking, she looked at it and she said, no, this is too large. I'm not going to give him such a large piece of cake. So she said, I'll make another one. Therefore, she kneaded another. So kneading is to make a dough or a paste with hands. So she prepared the material for another cake and made a smaller cake than the one she had earlier. But when she was baking it, while she turned it over, she saw that this was also as large as the previous cake. Then she took a tiny scrap of dough. So next she took a very small piece, a tiny piece of dough and rolled it flat. Now she's rolled it very flat and baked it thin as a wafer. She made it such a thin cake. It was as thin as a wafer. But she couldn't part with that. The cake was very, very thin. She had barely used any dough in it. She still couldn't part with it. She still did not want to give it to Saint Peter. Children, wafers are like, do you have potato chips? Those thin wafer-like chips. See how thin they are? Imagine a cake or even a chapati which is that thin. Would it fill anybody's stomach? If a person is so hungry, will you give him so little? When she could easily have given him any of the cakes that she had already baked, but she was too small-hearted. She was too miserly, greedy rather. She wanted everything only for herself. She was so selfish. She did not have the heart to share it with the poor man who was asking her for food, even though he did say he was very hungry and he was feeling faint, feeling very weak. So how did the woman react when St. Peter asked her for a cake? She agreed to give him cake, but she tried to make a cake which was as small as possible. For she said, my cakes that seem too small when I eat them myself are yet too large to give away. So here she knows that the cake that she has baked for the person who has come asking for food for St. Peter is very small. She says, when I want to eat it, I find it very small. This will not fill my stomach. But when I have to give it to someone, I feel it's too big. So she put them on the shelf. Imagine that she did not even give the thin wafer-like cake to the man who was asking for it. Now she doesn't know that it is St. Peter, okay? She thinks it's some ordinary man who's asking for food. Then good St. Peter grew angry, for he was hungry and faint. And surely such a woman was enough to provoke a saint. So now, how does this affect St. Peter? Now, St. Peter is supposed to be, like, he's a saint. He's supposed to be very calm. Yet, he grows angry because he was hungry and he was feeling very weak. And then he saw the behavior of this woman who was so greedy, who was so selfish. He got so angry with her that he said, you're far too selfish to dwell in human form, to have both food and shelter and fire to keep you warm. So he says, woman, you are very selfish. You do not deserve to live in a human form. You do not deserve to be a human being, because human beings are supposed to be kind. Human beings are supposed to be generous and helpful and giving. He says, you don't deserve to have food and shelter. He says, you have a good house. You have a cottage to live in, you have food in your house, you have fire, you have the warmth of a fire in your hearth. What more do you need? And yet, you are so miserly, you are so selfish that you cannot share a little bit of food with another person. He says, you don't deserve to be a human being at all. Then he wants to punish her for this. He says, now you shall build as birds do. He says, you have a very nice cottage, but now you will have to make your own home as birds have to make their own nests. You have to work that hard to have even a small little nest, and shall get your scanty food by boring and boring and boring all day in the hard dry wood. He says that you will get very little food. At present, he says, you have a lot of food in your house. You have so many cakes, but you don't deserve them because you're so selfish. He says, you will have very little food, and that too, it will not be easy to get that food. You will have to bore and bore and bore into the wood, which is very difficult. Imagine boring into the wood with the beak all day long is very difficult. Who does this? Who has to bore into the wood to get some food? A woodpecker, that's right. A woodpecker has to keep boring into the hard, dry wood to get some food out of it. Children, boring means to dig, to drill into the wood. And a woodpecker has to dig with its beak, which is very, very tough. Then up she went through the chimney, never speaking a word. And out of the top flew a woodpecker, for she was changed to a bird. Now, children, this woman has transformed into a bird. So, how did Saint Peter punish her? He changed her into a bird. He says she does not deserve to live in a human form. She'll have to become a bird and live a very tough and difficult life like birds do. She had a scarlet cap on her head, and that was left the same. So, children, this woman was wearing a scarlet cap, a dark red cap on her head. Now, when she became a bird, she still had a scarlet head. That was left the same. But all the rest of her clothes were burned black as a coal in the flame. So now, because she had flown up through the chimney, that means there was a chimney above the hearth, above the fireplace. While she flew up the chimney, all her clothes got burnt. They became black, black as coal. So, when you see a woodpecker has a red head, like a scarlet cap on the head, and the rest of the woodpecker is black. So, this is what everyone thinks. The story goes that the woodpecker became a woodpecker because it was actually a very selfish and a greedy woman. So, it was Saint Peter who transformed her into a bird, a woodpecker with a red head and a black body. And every country schoolboy had seen her in the wood, where she lives in the trees till this very day, boring and boring for food. So here the poetess says that every schoolboy in the countryside who passes that side has seen her in the wood, has seen her amongst the trees where she's living even now. And she's boring and boring for food. She's still digging into the hard, dry wood for food. She had a very easy, very comfortable life earlier, but because she was not thankful for that, there was no gratitude and there was no sharing, no caring, no generosity in her. Had she been kind and generous, she would have still lived very comfortably in her cottage. If the woman had known that it was Saint Peter who had come to her house, would she have behaved the same way? Or would she have given him the best of her cakes to get his blessings? Now, children, let's discuss the poetic devices in the poem. So, one of the poetic devices used here is rhyming words. These are words which end with the same sound. Examples are few, through, true, you, below, no. Now, I would like you to find some more rhyming words in the poem. Another poetic device used here is rhyme scheme. Rhyme scheme sees the rhyming of the last word of each line in a stanza. So, in the first stanza, we see the last word of the first line is Northland. So, that is assigned the code A. The last word of the second line is few. Does few rhyme with Northland? No. So, this is assigned the code B. The last word of the third line is winter. Does it rhyme with Northland? No. Does it rhyme with few? No. So, this is assigned the code C. The last word of the fourth line is through. Does through rhyme with Northland? No. Does through rhyme with few? Yes, it does. So, through is also assigned the code B. Thus, the rhyme scheme of the first stanza is A, B, C, B. Now, I would like you to find out the rhyme scheme of the rest of the stanzas in the poem. There are 16 stanzas in all. Let's see what the rhyme scheme is. Another poetic device used here is alliteration. Alliteration is the repetition of a consonant sound in the beginning of the words which are in close proximity with each other in a line. Examples of alliteration are that they cannot sleep them through. So here the sound is repeated in that, they, them. Another example is funny furry clothes. Here the f sound is repeated. There are many other examples of alliteration here. I would like you to find out other examples of alliteration in the poem. Another poetic device used here is repetition of words. The examples are away, away, boring and boring and boring. Words are repeated to give extra emphasis to them. So away, away meant it was very far away. So boring, boring, boring are repeated to show that the bird has to go on digging and digging and digging for food. Another poetic device used here is a simile. An example of that is black as a coal. Her clothes were burned black as a coal. So children, black as a coal is a simile. I would like you to make a list of similes like red as a rose, white as snow. So there are many beautiful similes. You must make a list of at least 10 similes. Another poetic device used here is assonance. This is repetition of a vowel sound in the word set close to each other. Here the sound is not at the beginning of the word, but it is in the middle. Where they harness. Here the repetition of E sound is used. Where they harness. In funny furry clothes, the sound of U, sound is repeated. Children, I hope you've enjoyed the poem and learned the poetic devices well. Children, let's have a quiz now. The poem is set in Northland, Netherland, New Zealand or Neverland.
Northland.
That's correct. In the poem, the sledges were pulled by horses, dogs, reindeers or bears.
Reindeers.
That's correct. The children looked like lion cubs, bear cubs, puppies, pandas.
Bear cubs.
That's correct. The little woman's cottage was visited by Saint Patrick, Saint Peter, Saint Xavier, Saint Stephen.
Saint Peter.
That's correct. Saint Peter asked the woman for shelter, milk, cake, clothes.
Cake.
Correct. Saint Peter became angry with the woman because she was foolish, selfish, slow, naughty.
Selfish.
You are right. Saint Peter cursed the woman and transformed her into a woodpecker, nightingale, cat, crow.
Woodpecker.
Absolutely right. You got all the answers right. Well done, child. Children, you must ask the elders in your family to tell you about all the legends in your culture. And then I would like you to write the story of your favorite legend. So children, did you enjoy the poem? I'm sure you did. It was such a lovely story in the form of a poem, a legend, a ballad. Do you think the story is true? No, it isn't. But it feels true because there is something in it which teaches us to be more human, to be more humane, to be kind and loving and caring towards others. It builds up our morals. So children, I hope we are much the better from having read the story and learnt all these values.